September 15th, 1940, 11:27 hours. RAF Hornchurch, Essex. Squadron leader Brian Lane was strapping into his Spitfire's cockpit when the order came through the radio. Scramble, Vector 120, Angels 20, large raid forming over Calais. 26 minutes, warning. Lane's engine was already running. They'd been at readiness since dawn, sitting in cockpits, waiting. The Merlin engine roared to life. 11 Spitfires accelerated down the grass strip, lifting off in pairs, climbing hard toward 20,000 feet. 26 minutes to intercept a raid that was forming 60 miles away, across the Channel, over France. In 1938, this would have been impossible. Not difficult, impossible. There was no way to know enemy aircraft were forming up over Calais until they appeared over Dover, by which time they'd be halfway to London. Fighters would scramble after bombs were already falling, arriving too late to intercept, only managing to harass bombers on their return flight. The 10-minute problem, they'd called it. The mathematical reality that German bombers based in France could reach London in approximately 30 minutes, while British fighters required 15 minutes to reach interception altitude. By the time you knew bombers were coming, they were already nearly there. By the time fighters reached combat altitude, the bombers had dropped their loads and were turning for home. The Royal Air Force had studied this problem exhaustively in the mid-1930s. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. Defending Britain against massed bomber raids was mathematically impossible. The defenders simply couldn't react fast enough. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had stated it plainly in 1932, "The bomber will always get through." But Lane was climbing toward an interception that shouldn't exist, guided by information that shouldn't be available, racing toward an enemy formation that he somehow knew about, despite it being 60 miles away and not yet even crossing the English coast. Sapper leader, this is Bentley. Vector 135. Raid now confirmed as 50-plus bandits. 20 Dorniers with fighter escort. Currently over mid-channel, altitude 18,000 feet, heading 310 degrees. The voice belonged to a WAF, Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer sitting in a concrete bunker 30 feet underground at RAF Uxbridge, watching colored markers move across a giant map table. She was reading information from status boards that were being updated by other WAFs receiving telephone reports from observation posts scattered along the coast. Those observation posts were receiving their information from a chain of steel towers that had appeared along Britain's coastline in the 3 years before the war. Ugly, angular structures that looked like electricity pylons, each one topped with rectangular antenna arrays that rotated slowly, searching the sky with invisible radio waves. Chain home. The radar network that shouldn't have existed, built on principles that serious scientists had dismissed as impractical, operationalized by a system so complex it required hundreds of people working in perfect coordination. Lane's formation reached 18,000 feet, still climbing. The controller's voice came through again. Sapper leader, bandits now 40 miles southeast your position. Maintain current heading. You should have visual contact in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Lane scanned the sky ahead. Clear blue September sky. Scattered clouds at 15,000 feet, visibility unlimited. Somewhere out there, invisible still, 50 German aircraft were flying toward London, and somehow, impossibly, he was being guided to intercept them before they reached the coast. Tally-ho! That was Yellow 2, Pilot Officer Ginger Lacey. Bombers at 1 o'clock high. Lane saw them. A formation of Dornier Deuce 17s in tight V pattern, and above them, higher, the characteristic shapes of Messerschmitt Bf 109 escorts, exactly where the controller had said they'd be, exactly the numbers reported, exactly the heading predicted. Sapper Squadron, this is leader. Attack the bombers. Ignore the fighters unless they engage. The Spitfires dove. The mathematics that had made defending Britain impossible in 1938 had been completely inverted. German bombers, expecting to arrive over England with no warning and no interception, were instead meeting organized fighter opposition that was positioned, altitude-advantaged, and attacking with tactical precision. The Dorniers scattered as cannon fire tore through their formation. One bomber's port engine exploded, another fell away trailing smoke. The Bf-109s dove to engage, but Lane's squadron was already braking, pairs of Spitfires covering each other, using altitude and position advantage that they had, only because someone underground was watching invisible radio waves bounce off aircraft 60 miles away and translating that into vectors, altitudes, headings. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. 3 Dorniers destroyed, 2 damaged and forced to abort. 1 Spitfire damaged but returning to base. The surviving bombers jettisoned their loads over empty countryside and turned for France. Lane reformed his squadron and headed back to Hornchurch. Below, London continued its Sunday routine, largely unaware that a bomber raid had been intercepted and destroyed before reaching the city. Largely unaware that they'd just witnessed the practical application of a technology that senior scientists had declared impossible only 5 years earlier. 5 years earlier, February 1935. Air Ministry, London. The meeting room smelled like cigarette smoke and institutional pessimism. H.E. Wimperis, Director of Scientific Research at the Air Ministry, had assembled a small committee to address what everyone considered an unsolvable problem. How do you defend Britain against bomber attack when the bombers can reach their targets before you know they're coming? Gentlemen, I've asked Mr. Watson Watt to present a proposal, Wimperis said. Robert, if you would. Robert Watson Watt stood, a Scottish physicist, 43 years old, superintendent at the Radio Research Station in Slough. He'd been working on atmospheric radio research, studying how radio waves propagated and reflected. He had no background in military technology, no experience with air defense, and he was about to propose something that serious people would consider science fiction. The fundamental problem is detection, Watson Watt began. We can't defend against bombers we can't see coming. Visual observation provides minutes of warning at best. Sound detection, acoustic mirrors, provides slightly more, but requires perfect weather and trained operators. Both methods are inadequate. He pulled out a diagram showing radio waves emanating from a transmitter. Radio waves reflect off conductive objects. Aircraft are largely metal. Engines, fuselage, control surfaces. When radio waves strike an aircraft, some energy reflects back toward the source. If we can detect these reflections and measure their timing, we can determine the aircraft's range and bearing. The committee stared at him. You're proposing, one member said slowly, to detect aircraft using radio waves. Yes. Aircraft flying at, 10,000 feet? 20 miles away? You think you can bounce radio waves off them and receive measurable reflections? I think it's physically possible, yes. Have you tested this? Not specifically for aircraft detection, but we've observed radio wave reflections off atmospheric phenomena, off buildings, off various objects. The principles are sound. Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, quiet until now, sitting at the table's end, leaned forward. Mr. Watson Watt, what range do you estimate this system could achieve? That depends on transmission power, receiver sensitivity, and aircraft size. Theoretically, perhaps 50 miles, possibly more. 50 miles. Dowding did the mathematics silently. That's 40 minutes warning for bombers flying at typical speeds, enough time to scramble fighters, gain altitude, position for interception. Yes, sir. It would solve the 10-minute problem. Another committee member shook his head. It's too speculative. Radio detection of aircraft? The power requirements alone would be enormous. And even if you could detect something, how would you distinguish aircraft from birds, from weather, from atmospheric interference? Those are engineering problems, Watson Watt replied. Significant problems, certainly, but problems not impossibilities. The physics works. I can demonstrate it. How? Watson Watt pulled out calculations he'd prepared with his colleague Arnold Wilkins. We need a powerful radio transmitter. The BBC has one at Daventry, broadcasting on 49-meter wavelength. We need a receiver sensitive enough to detect reflected signals. We need an aircraft to fly through the beam. The BBC transmitter is already operating, already broadcasting continuously. All we need is to position a receiver 8 miles away and fly an aircraft through the transmission beam. If we detect reflected signals, we know the principle works. And if you don't detect anything? Another committee member asked. Then I'm wrong, and we've wasted 1 day of effort and minimal expense. But if I'm right, we've discovered a method to detect aircraft at ranges that make air defense practical. Dowding looked at Wimperis. Hugh, what's your assessment? Wimperis considered. He'd invited Watson Watt specifically because the situation was desperate enough to consider unconventional ideas. Britain's air defenses were inadequate. Everyone knew it. The question was whether anything could be done. I think, Wimperis said carefully, that Mr. Watson Watt's proposal is worth 1 day of testing. If it fails, we've lost nothing. If it succeeds, we may have found something extraordinary. Very well, Dowding said. Conduct your demonstration, Mr. Watson Watt. Show us that radio waves can detect aircraft. If you can prove the principle works, we'll discuss implementation. February 26, 1935, near Daventry, Northamptonshire. Watson Watt sat in the back of a Morris van, watching a cathode ray oscilloscope, while Arnold Wilkins adjusted the receiver. The BBC's Daventry transmitter was 3 miles away, broadcasting 10 kilowatts of radio power on 49-meter wavelength. They were positioned 8 miles from the transmitter, with a receiving antenna pointed toward the transmission path. A RAF Hayford bomber, obsolete, slow, but metal-framed and large, was flying a pattern through the radio beam at various altitudes and distances. Anything? Wilkins asked. Watson Watt watched the oscilloscope trace. In theory, when the bomber flew through the beam, reflected radio energy should create a visible signal spike on the scope. In theory. The trace jumped. A clear, definite spike. Appearing, fading, appearing again as the bomber flew through the beam, creating reflected signals that their receiver could detect. Watson Watt marked the time, calculated based on the aircraft's known position. The reflection timing correlated with the bomber's range. When the aircraft was closer, the reflection arrived sooner. When farther, the reflection delayed. Basic physics, but physics that proved the principle worked. Get me another test run, Watson Watt said quietly. Different altitude. I want multiple confirmations. They ran 6 tests. Every time the bomber flew through the beam, the oscilloscope showed reflected signals. Every time the aircraft's position changed, the reflection timing changed correspondingly. The correlation was perfect. Watson Watt sat back in the van, looking at the oscilloscope trace that proved something everybody had considered impractical. You could detect aircraft using radio waves. You could determine their range by measuring reflection timing. And if you could do it once, you could do it continuously, systematically, at longer ranges with purpose-built equipment. The 10-minute problem had just become solvable. He wrote his report that evening. Radio detection of aircraft is practical and can be developed into an operational system providing early warning of approaching raids. Recommend immediate development of prototype stations with goal of operational deployment within 2 years. 2 years. Britain had perhaps 3 years before war came. Everyone who understood German rearmament knew that. 3 years to transform a successful laboratory experiment into a nationwide defensive network. 3 years to build transmitters, receivers, antenna arrays, train operators, develop procedures, integrate with Fighter Command, create an entire system from scratch. It was barely enough time. But it was time they had only because Watson Watt had proposed something crazy, because Wimperis had been desperate enough to test it, and because a bomber flying through invisible radio waves had reflected signals that proved the impossible was merely difficult. Dowding received the report 2 days later. He read it 3 times, understanding that he was looking at something that would either save Britain or represent the most expensive failed experiment in military history. He approved immediate development funding. The race against time had begun, and somewhere in Germany, Luftwaffe planners were designing bomber formations that would attack an England they assumed couldn't see them coming. They were wrong. They just didn't know it yet. May 1935, Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk. The requisitioned estate sat on a cliff overlooking the North Sea. 360 acres of land that the Air Ministry had acquired with unusual urgency and unusual secrecy. Watson Watt walked the grounds with a team of engineers, surveyors, and increasingly bewildered construction contractors who kept asking what, exactly, they were building. Radio research facility, Watson Watt said, which was technically true and completely inadequate. What they were actually building was the world's first operational radar station, though the word radar didn't exist yet. They called it RDF, Radio Direction Finding, a deliberately vague name that revealed nothing to potential spies while allowing engineers to discuss the project without constant security complications. The key component was already under construction. 4 steel towers, each 240 feet tall, positioned in a line. Between them would be strung antenna arrays, copper wire in precise geometric patterns, designed to transmit and receive radio waves at specific frequencies. The transmitter towers would send pulses of radio energy into the sky. The receiver towers would detect reflections from aircraft. 240 feet, the lead contractor repeated, looking at the engineering drawings with visible skepticism. You want 4 towers, 240 feet tall, to string wire between them, for radio research? Yes. Right. The contractor didn't believe it, but he'd been paid enough to not ask further questions. Foundations will take 3 months. Steel fabrication, another 2. Erection and antenna installation, another 2 months minimum. You're looking at autumn before this is operational. Make it summer, Watson Watt said. Double the crews if necessary. This needs to be working by July. Because July would give them perhaps 2 years before war came, and 2 years was barely enough time to prove the system worked, refine it, build more stations, train operators, and integrate radar into Fighter Command's defensive operations. The contractor left, muttering about unreasonable schedules and mysterious government projects. Watson Watt turned to his deputy, A.P. Rowe. We need to solve 5 problems simultaneously, Watson Watt said. First, transmitter power. The Daventry demonstration used existing BBC transmission. We need dedicated transmitters with higher power and precise frequency control. Second, receiver sensitivity. We need to detect reflections from aircraft at 50 miles minimum. That requires receivers far more sensitive than anything currently available. Third, antenna design. We need to transmit and receive directionally to determine not just range but bearing. Fourth, display technology. Operators need to see the data in usable form. Fifth, operational integration. The technology is meaningless if Fighter Command can't use it effectively. Rowe had been taking notes. He stopped writing, looking at the list. Robert, each of those problems could take years to solve individually. You want all 5 solved simultaneously in less than 2 years. Then we'd better start immediately. They started immediately. The transmitter problem was assigned to a team at Metropolitan Vickers, who began designing high-power RF transmitters operating at wavelengths between 10 and 13 meters, chosen because those frequencies provided optimal reflection from aircraft while penetrating weather. The transmitters would pulse, sending brief bursts of energy, then listening for reflections during the silent periods. Pulse timing would indicate range. A reflection returning after 0.001 seconds meant the aircraft was approximately 50 miles away, since radio waves traveled at the speed of light. The receiver problem went to EMI and other electronics firms who began developing amplifiers sensitive enough to detect signals that had traveled 100 miles total, 50 miles to the aircraft, 50 miles back, and been reflected off a metal object perhaps 50 feet across. The signal strength loss was enormous. Detecting it required vacuum tube amplifiers pushing the boundaries of 1930s electronics technology. The antenna problem Watson Watt kept largely in-house, with his team at BWWII experimenting with different wire configurations, trying to find arrangements that would transmit and receive directionally. They needed to know not just that an aircraft was out there, but where, bearing and altitude in addition to range. By August 1935, BWWII had its first operational test. The towers stood 240 feet tall, antenna arrays strung between them, a transmitter house at the base pumping 200 kilowatts of pulsed RF energy into the sky. In a separate building, receivers processed reflected signals and fed them to cathode ray displays where operators could see signal returns as glowing spots on phosphorescent screens. Watson Watt stood in the receiver building, watching the displays, while a Hawker Hart biplane flew a test pattern 20 miles offshore. The display showed a spike, clear, definite, tracking the aircraft's movement. Range, 18 miles. Bearing, approximately 85 degrees. The correlation with the Hart's known position was imperfect. Their directional antenna design needed work, but it was there. They were detecting aircraft at operational ranges. "It works," Rowe said quietly. "Version 1 works," Watson Watt corrected. "Now we need version 2 to work better, faster, at longer range, with better angular resolution. And we need it deployed along the entire coast before Germany decides to test whether we can actually defend ourselves." September 1935, Air Ministry Conference Room. Hugh Dowding, now Air Chief Marshal Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command, studied the report from BWWII. The numbers were promising. Detection ranges exceeding 40 miles, reasonably accurate bearing information, reliable operation in various weather conditions. The technology worked. The question was whether it could be operationalized at the scale required. "How many stations would we need?" Dowding asked Watson Watt. "To provide coverage of the approaches to London, the industrial Midlands, the ports?" Watson Watt had prepared for this question. He unrolled a map of southern England, marked with circles representing radar coverage. "Each station can detect aircraft approximately 50 miles away. That's our current maximum range, though we're working to extend it. To provide overlapping coverage from Southampton to Newcastle, covering all likely German approach routes, I estimate we need 20 stations minimum. Ideally 25, to ensure no gaps. 25 stations." Dowding calculated costs mentally, each requiring towers, transmitters, receivers, operators, maintenance personnel, communications links to Fighter Command. "You're proposing we build an entirely new defensive infrastructure based on technology that was laboratory curiosity 6 months ago." "Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm proposing. The cost will be enormous, less than losing the next war." Dowding smiled slightly. He appreciated directness. "True. But I need to justify this to Treasury, to the Air Ministry, to people who don't understand radio technology and won't believe aircraft can be detected by invisible waves. I need proof that this system will work operationally, not just in controlled tests." "Then let me propose a demonstration," Watson Watt said. "Give me 3 months to refine BWWII's systems, then conduct a full-scale exercise. Bombers approaching from various directions, at various altitudes, with no advance warning to the radar operators. We'll detect them, track them, report their positions to Fighter Command, and you can scramble fighters for interception. If the system works, you'll have your proof. If it fails, you've wasted 3 months and I'll resign. Dowding considered. The political situation in Europe was deteriorating. Germany had repudiated the Treaty of Versailles, announcing rearmament. The Luftwaffe was being rebuilt openly. Intelligence estimates suggested Germany would have significant bomber capability within 2 years. Britain needed air defenses that worked, and it needed them soon. 3 months, Dowding said. Demonstrate that this system can provide useful early warning under realistic conditions. If you succeed, I'll get you funding for the full network. If you fail, we'll look for alternatives. We won't fail, Watson-Watt said. December 1935. Exercise Homeward Bound. The demonstration began at dawn. 6 RAF bombers, Hayfords and Hinds, took off from bases in the Midlands, flying varied routes toward London at different altitudes and timings. Nobody at Bawdsey knew the flight plans. This was genuine blind testing. Detect unknown aircraft, track them, report to Fighter Command in time for defensive response. Watson-Watt stood in Bawdsey's operations room. Still crude, still experimental, but functional. 3 operators watched cathode ray displays showing returns from the radar transmissions. Each display represented a different receiver antenna, providing overlapping coverage with slightly different angles. Contact, one operator reported. Bearing 290 degrees, range approximately 35 miles. A plotter marked the position on a map table. Another operator called the sighting to Fighter Command over dedicated telephone line. At Fighter Command headquarters, controllers updated their own map, calculating interception vectors. Second contact, bearing 320 degrees, range 42 miles. More plotters, more telephone calls. The map was filling with tracks. Aircraft positions updated every few seconds as radar pulses reflected off the bombers and receivers processed the returns. Third contact, multiple aircraft, bearing 015 degrees, range 38 miles. Formation estimated 3 aircraft. The system was working. Not perfectly. Some altitude estimates were imprecise. Some bearing calculations had several degrees error. But it was working. Fighter Command was receiving warnings 30-40 minutes before bombers would reach their targets. Enough time to scramble, climb, intercept. Dowding, observing from Fighter Command headquarters, watched his controllers vector fighters toward bombers they couldn't see yet, guided purely by radar reports. The mathematics that had made defending Britain impossible were being inverted in real time. The exercise ran for 3 hours. Bawdsey detected all 6 bombers, tracked their routes, provided continuous position updates. Fighter Command scrambled interceptors that successfully located 4 of the 6 bombers. The other 2 were missed due to fighter navigation errors, not radar failures. After the exercise, Watson-Watt received a brief message from Dowding. Approved. Proceed with full network deployment. January 1936 through August 1939. The race against time. Building 20 stations in 3 years required industrial mobilization that Britain barely understood how to execute. Each station needed 4 240-foot transmitter towers and 4 240-foot receiver towers. Transmitter buildings housing 350-kilowatt pulsed RF generators, receiver buildings with sensitive amplifiers and display systems, operations buildings for operators, plotters, communications staff, backup power generators, maintenance facilities, living quarters, telephone lines to Fighter Command headquarters. Trained operators who understood what they were seeing on displays. The first station, Bawdsey itself, was operational by early 1937. The second, at Dover, came online in May 1937. Then Canewdon, then Dunkirk, in Kent, not France. One by one, steel towers rose along Britain's coast, each station testing and refining the system, each adding coverage to what was becoming chain home. the radar network that would either save Britain or represent history's most expensive defensive failure. The technology improved continuously. By 1938, detection ranges exceeded 100 miles. Altitude estimation improved through multiple antenna configurations. IFF, identification friend or foe, transponders allowed radar to distinguish British aircraft from German. Display systems evolved from crude oscilloscopes to clearer cathode ray presentations with better operator interfaces. But the most critical development wasn't technological, it was organizational. Watson Watt realized early that radar alone was useless. You needed a system. Radar detection feeding to operations rooms analyzing tracks and scrambling fighters being vectored to intercepts by controllers with comprehensive situational awareness. The technology was only one component of a larger defensive network. Fighter Command developed the Dowding system, named for the Air Chief Marshal who'd championed it. Every radar station fed data to sector operations rooms. Sector rooms consolidated tracks from multiple stations, filtered out weather returns and spurious signals, and created coherent air pictures showing all detected aircraft. This data went to group operations rooms, then to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where commanders could see the entire battle space simultaneously. Fighters were organized into sectors, each with assigned patrol areas and scramble times. When radar detected inbound raids, sector controllers would scramble squadrons, vector them toward bombers, provide continuous updates as the tactical situation evolved. Pilots didn't hunt blindly. They were guided precisely to intercepts. The human element required as much development as the technology. Radar operators, mostly WAFs, young women recruited from civilian life, learned to interpret displays that showed not aircraft, but electronic reflections of aircraft. They learned to distinguish genuine targets from ground clutter, from weather, from atmospheric phenomena. They learned to estimate altitude from signal strength and display characteristics. They learned to remain calm while tracking raids of 50-plus aircraft heading toward British cities. Plotters learned to translate verbal reports into map positions updated every few seconds. Controllers learned to manage multiple engagements simultaneously, to prioritize threats, to husband fighter resources against successive raids. Telephone operators learned to maintain communications under stress. By summer 1939, chain home stretched from Southampton to Newcastle, 18 stations providing overlapping coverage of all approaches to southeastern England. 3 more stations were under construction in Scotland. Training was ongoing. Procedures were being refined continuously based on exercises and tests. The system was ready. Just barely. Just in time. But ready. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3rd, Britain declared war. And along Britain's coast, radar operators sat at their displays, watching invisible radio waves bounce off aircraft they couldn't see with their eyes, translating reflections into positions that would guide fighters toward intercepts that would determine whether Britain survived. Watson Watt's crazy idea, dismissed as impractical 4 years earlier, was about to face the only test that mattered: actual combat against an enemy that didn't know the invisible shield existed. The Battle of Britain was coming, and Britain could see it coming from 100 miles away. The chain that could see through clouds. By the summer of 1940, Britain possessed something unprecedented in military history: eyes that could see through darkness, clouds, and over horizons. But chain home wasn't just a technological marvel. It was an intricate system where cutting-edge physics met human ingenuity, where split-second decisions depended on teenage plotters moving markers across maps, and where the future of warfare was being written in real time. The physics of the invisible how chain home actually worked. The principle was elegantly simple, the execution fiendishly complex. Each chain home station transmitted radio waves at 20-30 MHz, wavelengths of about 10-15 meters. These weren't the tight, focused beams of later radar systems. They were broad, sweeping floods of radio energy that washed across the sky like an invisible searchlight. When these waves struck a metal aircraft, something remarkable happened. The aircraft's structure acted like an antenna, absorbing the radio energy and re-radiating it in all directions. A tiny fraction of this reflected energy, perhaps 1 part in a trillion of the original transmission, bounced back toward Britain. The receiving towers, positioned a few miles from the transmitters to avoid interference, listened for these whispers. 4 wooden towers, 240 feet tall, held crossed dipole antennas that could determine not just that something was out there, but roughly where it was in the sky. The mathematics of detection. The operators watched oscilloscope screens showing green traces. The horizontal axis represented time, and therefore distance, since radio waves traveled at the speed of light. A pulse transmitted at the start of the trace would appear as a spike. If an aircraft was present, a second spike would appear later on the trace. The delay told them the range. If the echo appeared 0.01 seconds after transmission, the aircraft was 93 miles away, radio waves traveling 186,000 miles per second, covering the round trip. The vertical axis showed signal strength from different receiving antennas. By comparing the strength of signals received on antennas pointing in different directions, operators could estimate the bearing, the direction to the target. Altitude was trickier. Chain-Home used an ingenious method. The radio waves reflected not just off the aircraft, but also off the ground or sea below. These two reflections, direct and ground bounce, interfered with each other. The pattern of interference changed with the aircraft's height. Skilled operators learned to read these patterns, estimating altitude with surprising accuracy. The human computer network inside a Chain-Home station, RAF WWII, 0630 hours, August 12, 1940. WAF, Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Corporal Margaret Thompson sat before her receiver, headphones clamped over her ears, eyes fixed on the oscilloscope. She'd been on duty since 0600, and the morning watch had been quiet. Just the usual clutter of returns from ships in the channel. Then, at 0637, something changed. A new trace appeared on her screen, faint but unmistakable. She measured the delay. At 0.086 seconds. Quick mental calculation, about 80 miles. She checked the bearing by comparing signal strengths on different antennas, roughly 110 degrees, southeast, over France. But this wasn't a single aircraft. The echo was too broad, too strong. She'd learned to recognize the signatures. This was many aircraft, flying close together. "Contact," she called out. "Bearing 110, range 80 miles, multiple aircraft." Her supervisor, Sergeant Davies, appeared at her shoulder. "Height?" Margaret studied the interference pattern. "Estimating Angels 1-5, 15,000 feet. Davies picked up the telephone to Fighter Command. "Hostile raid, designation raid 14, bearing 110, range 80, Angels 1-5, strength 20+. The information was already racing toward London. The filter room, Fighter Command headquarters, Bentley Priory, source 640 hours. The call from WWII arrived at the filter room, where WAF plotters stood around a large map table showing southeastern England and the approaches across the channel. Each plotter wore headphones connected to specific radar stations. WAF Sergeant Patricia Williams received the WWII report. She placed a colored wooden block on the map at the reported position, 80 miles southeast of the station. The block was marked 14 for the raid number and showed 20+ for estimated strength. But she didn't stop there. Within seconds, reports arrived from other Chain-Home stations: Dunkirk, the station, not the French town, Dover, and Fournes. Each had detected the same formation, but from different angles and ranges. This was where the system's genius emerged. Patricia and her fellow plotters were performing triangulation. using multiple observations to pinpoint the raid's exact location. Where the bearing lines from different stations crossed, that's where the enemy actually was. The filter room's purpose was to take raw, sometimes contradictory data from multiple stations and produce a single, accurate picture. Senior controllers watched the plotters work, resolving conflicts, eliminating false returns, clouds, flocks of birds, atmospheric anomalies, and building a coherent picture of the air battle developing over the channel. The operations room. One floor below, in Fighter Command's operations room, the filtered information appeared on an even larger map table. This was the nerve center of Britain's air defense, a room that would become iconic in British history. More WAF plotters stood around this table, receiving information by telephone from the filter room above. As reports came in, they moved colored markers across the map. Each marker represented a raid, its position, heading, altitude, and estimated strength. The colors changed every 5 minutes. Red for the current 5-minute period, yellow for the previous, blue for the one before that. This simple system let controllers see at a glance not just where raids were, but where they'd been, their track and speed. Around the room's perimeter, on a raised gallery, sat the controllers, senior RAF officers who would make the decisions that meant life or death for pilots and civilians alike. They watched the plot develop, seeing the battle unfold in a way no military commander in history had ever seen before. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, responsible for London and southeastern England, stood at his position on the gallery. Before radar, he would have been blind until enemy aircraft crossed the coast, giving him perhaps 10 minutes warning. Now, he could see Raid 14 forming up over France, watch it cross the channel, and predict where it was heading. Raid 14 is tracking toward Dover, reported a controller. Estimated 20-plus bandits, Angels 15, speed 180. Park studied the plot. 20-plus aircraft, probably bombers with fighter escort. Heading for Dover could mean they were targeting the port or the radar stations, or it could be a feint before turning toward London. He made his decision. Scramble 32 Squadron from Biggin Hill. Vector them to Dover, Angels 20. The order went out. At Biggin Hill, pilots sprinted to their Hurricanes. Within minutes, they were airborne, climbing hard. But here was the system's true magic. Park could see both the enemy and his own fighters. As 32 Squadron climbed, their positions appeared on the plot, friendly markers in a different color. He could watch them converge with Raid 14, could adjust their course if the enemy changed direction, could vector them to the perfect interception point. The technology behind the magic. The transmitters, each chain. Home station's transmitter was a beast, a 350-kilowatt monster that could be heard crackling and humming from hundreds of yards away. The valves, vacuum tubes alone were the size of fire extinguishers, glowing orange-hot during operation. The system transmitted pulses, brief bursts of radio energy lasting about 20 microseconds, repeated 25 times per second. Between pulses, the transmitter fell silent, and the receivers listened for echoes. This pulse system was crucial. Continuous transmission would have overwhelmed the sensitive receivers. By transmitting in brief bursts, the system could listen for the faint echoes between pulses. The receivers. The receiving equipment was even more remarkable for its sensitivity. It had to detect signals 1 trillion times weaker than the transmitted pulse, like hearing a whisper in a hurricane. The receivers used superheterodyne technology, mixing the incoming signal with a locally generated frequency to produce an intermediate frequency that was easier to amplify and process. Multiple stages of amplification boosted the signal until it was strong enough to display on the oscilloscope. But amplification brought noise, random electrical fluctuations that could mask the signal. The operators learned to distinguish between noise and genuine returns. looking for the characteristic shape and timing of aircraft echoes. The limitations. Chain home wasn't perfect. Its long wavelength meant poor resolution. It couldn't distinguish individual aircraft in a tight formation. The broad beam meant imprecise bearing information. And it had a blind spot. It couldn't see aircraft flying very low, below about 500 feet, because the radio waves skipped over them, reflected by the ground. The Germans would eventually exploit this, sending raiders in at wave-top height. But in the summer of 1940, most Luftwaffe formations flew high, where chain home could see them perfectly. The intelligence layer, the observer corps. Radar saw the enemy coming, but once aircraft crossed the coast, they often dropped below chain home's coverage. This is where the Royal Observer Corps took over. 30,000 volunteers manning 1,400 observation posts across Britain. These posts were simple: a telephone, binoculars, and aircraft recognition charts. When observers spotted aircraft, they reported to their sector center: type, number, height, heading. This information fed into the same plotting system, maintaining continuous tracking as raids crossed inland. The Observer Corps was low-tech, but essential. They filled the gaps in radar coverage and provided visual confirmation of what the electronic eyes had seen. Radio intelligence. Britain had another advantage. They could hear the Luftwaffe talking. WWII service listening stations intercepted German radio communications. While Enigma decryption provided strategic intelligence, tactical radio intercepts gave real-time information about raids forming up, units being scrambled, even bomber crews reporting their positions. This intelligence flowed into the same system, adding another layer to the picture. Controllers could sometimes predict raids before radar detected them, based on the pattern of German radio traffic. The system in action. A typical interception sequence. 0637. Chain home stations detect raid 14 forming over France. 0640. Filter room triangulates position, confirms 20-plus aircraft. 0642. Operations room receives plot, identifies raid heading toward Dover. 0644. Park orders 32 Squadron scrambled from Biggin Hill. 0647. 32 Squadron airborne, climbing. 0652. Raid 14 crosses French coast, heading for Channel. 0655. Ground controllers begin vectoring 32 Squadron toward intercept point. 0702. Observer Corps reports visual contact with Raid 14 crossing coast. 0705. Controller: tally-ho, bandits at 2 o'clock, Angels 1-5. 0706. 32 Squadron engages from first detection to interception. 29 minutes. Before radar, the RAF would have had perhaps 5 minutes warning, not enough time to get fighters airborne, let alone position them for an effective attack. The human element, the pressure. The system's effectiveness depended entirely on the humans operating it. WAF plotters worked in shifts, maintaining concentration for hours, while moving markers across maps with long wooden rakes. A single mistake, a transposed digit in a range report, a misidentified raid number, could send fighters to the wrong location. The stress was enormous. These young women, many barely out of their teens, knew that their accuracy directly affected whether pilots lived or died, whether bombs fell on cities or were intercepted. Margaret Thompson, the BWDSI operator, would later recall, "You couldn't think about the consequences. You just focused on your screen, your measurements, getting the numbers right. But at night, lying in your bunk, you'd think about the pilots, wonder if your reports had helped them, or—" She never finished that sentence. The learning curve. The system required constant refinement. Operators learned to recognize different types of returns: the strong, steady echo of a large bomber formation versus the weaker, more erratic returns from fighters. They learned to spot jamming attempts, atmospheric anomalies, equipment malfunctions. Controllers learned to interpret the plot, to predict enemy intentions from the pattern of raids, to position their limited fighter resources for maximum effect. It was part science, part art, and entirely dependent on experience. By August 1940, the system had been operating for nearly a year. The operators and controllers had developed an almost intuitive understanding of how it worked, what it could and couldn't do. This expertise would prove crucial in the desperate weeks ahead. The invisible advantage. The Luftwaffe knew Britain had radar. German intelligence had identified the chain-home towers, even photographed them, but they fundamentally misunderstood what they were seeing. German radar research had focused on short wavelengths and precise, narrow beams, technically superior, but harder to implement. They looked at chain-home's crude towers and long wavelengths and concluded it was primitive, probably ineffective. They were catastrophically wrong. What the Germans missed was the system, the integration of radar detection, fighter control, and communications into a seamless whole. They saw the technology, but missed the organization, the training, the doctrine that made it effective. This misunderstanding would cost them dearly in the battle to come.